I also have personal things that I won't share. I will introduce our last and third speaker, Professor Joshua Berman, which is of the Ilan University Tanakh Department and is the author of The Created Equal, How the Bible Broke with Ancient Political Thought, which was a National Jewish Book Award finalist in scholarship, and which Professor Berman claims was inspired by Rabbi Sacks' book, Radical Then, Radical Now. He is also the author of Inconsistency in the Torah, Ancient Literary Convention, and the Limits of Criticism, a book he dedicated to Rabbi Sacks. His commentary on the Book of Lamentations with the new Cambridge Bible Commentary series is due out later this year. So his title will be Forgiveness Studies in the Writing of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks, a case study of his use of social thought. Please.
About a month after Rabbi Sacks passed away, Joanna Ben Arosh, who spoke to us last night, Rabbi Sacks' chief of staff, was kind enough to sit with me for an hour over Zoom to visit with me as I worked through my own grief. Over the 30 years that Rabbi Sacks had mentored me, there was always a question I had long thought to ask her, but felt that it wouldn't be appropriate to do so during his lifetime. And now, here we were. I said to her, how did he work with and manage his research assistants? And Josh, she said, there were no research assistants. He did all the reading and retrieval on his own. I pondered that and then followed up, well, then there must be extensive files on his computer of notes from all that reading. No, she said, I don't believe he ever took notes. You had to see his books. They were full of dog-eared pages and sticky notes. So I would like today to examine how Rabbi Sacks assimilated and grappled with one of those dog-eared pages, because he referenced it at least a half dozen times in the last decade of his life. The book in question has a tantalizing title, Before Forgiveness, by the American classicist David Constant. Constant makes a bold claim that what we mean today when we speak of asking for forgiveness or granting forgiveness is nowhere found in Greek and Roman classical literature, and in fact is a relatively modern notion. So let me lay out what Constant means by this surprising claim. Let's begin by listing the elements that constitute what we routinely think of when we think of forgiveness. I'm going to call this the process of moral transformation. It entails a set of actions and dispositions by the offender and also by the victim. The offender should engage in introspection and realize that he has done wrong. He should verbally accept responsibility for what he did in the presence of the victim. He should express regret for the pain and damage he has inflicted on the victim. And finally, he should commit to changing his ways in the future. For his part, the victim should recognize the moral transformation the offender has undergone and renounce bitterness because the offender is now a changed person. Through his moral transformation, the offender has earned forgiveness. Forgiving entails a performative act in which the former victim expresses his forgiveness to the offender. And critically, the victim should offer forgiveness solely on the basis of the moral transformation he sees in the offender. There should be no demand for compensation, public humiliation, or personal retribution. By contrast, Constant notes, in classical literature, when one party injures another, what is called for may be termed the restoration of status and honor. Here, we rarely see an offender engage in introspection. There is little acceptance of responsibility for the pain caused or admission of wrongdoing. Figures in this literature offer no expression of regret or remorse. There is no value placed on the process of moral transformation by the offender. Instead, the offense is a slight to the status and authority of the victim, and this is what must be restored. The offender must engage in self-abasement and self-humiliation before the victim. A supplicant may say something like, I willingly submit to your authority. I humble myself to you and ask submissively that you not use your authority to harm me. I value our relationship and recognize your superiority. Here, as opposed to what happens in moral transformation, offenders will resort to excuses. My family was hungry. That's why I stole from you. This is not to evade responsibility, but to make it clear to the offended party that the offense was not motivated out of a desire to disrespect the victim, but rather the difficult circumstances at hand. The process of moral transformation is intuitive for us because we live in an egalitarian society. The ethos of all men are created equal is axiomatic for us, and thus when offense or injury is committed, we are nearly blind to thinking about the issue in terms of the relative status of the parties. Existentially, we are all equals. But in the hierarchical worlds of Greece and Rome, status is a cherished commodity. Offenses between individuals upset that balance. Before Forgiveness was published in 2010, and thereafter Rabbi Sachs referred to it in at least a half dozen writings and occasions. Using Constance's dichotomy between moral transformation and the restoration of honor and status, Rabbi Sachs frequently contrasts two stories of reconciliation in the book of Genesis. On the one hand, reconciliation between Jacob and Esau, and that between Joseph and his brothers on the other hand. In both stories, the offended party, Esau and Joseph respectively, renounce bitterness and forego retribution against the offender. But the processes for Rabbi Sachs are fundamentally different. When Jacob encounters Esau, Rabbi Sachs maintains, Esau is mollified because his status has been restored, not because of a moral transformation on the part of Jacob. In that story, nowhere does Jacob express what he did to Esau, how he feels about it now, what steps he will take in the future. Instead, the episode is one grand expression of Yaakov's self-abasement and humiliation designed to appease Esau. He sends elaborate gifts, refers to Esau as my lord, and to himself as your servant, and prostrates himself 7 times before his older brother. This brings me to Constance's comments concerning the reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers and Rabbi Sachs's appropriation of Constance's work for his own elucidation of that story. All of us have marveled at Rabbi Sachs' capacity to draw from an incredibly wide range of academic disciplines. But what is less obvious is that to make academic arguments accessible and inspiring for the wider public, Rabbi Sachs often had to forego some of the nuance and complexity of his original academic sources. Tracing his use of Constance's observations concerning the Joseph story is a window into that process and the imperatives that governed it. As noted, Constance reviews accounts of reconciliation in classical literature and finds no processes of moral transformation, as laid out here earlier, and finds only processes of restoring honor and stature. Moving on from classical literature, he then notes, almost as an aside, is the way he puts it, almost as an aside, that, quote, the Hebrew Bible is not without examples of personal forgiveness, and recounts the account of reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers in Genesis 50. Yet note how Rabbi Sachs incorporates this idea in a covenant and conversation essay. He opens by citing the reconciliation account of Joseph and his brothers. I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt, and now do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. It was not you who sent me here, but God. And to this, he immediately adds, this is the first recorded moment in history in which one human being forgives another. Now, based on what Constance had written, this is not an overstatement. As Constance finds, no accounts in classical literature of forgiveness in the sense of moral transformation outlined above. Constance had mentioned the Joseph story as an aside, but Rabbi Sachs goes to town with it. We see here a primary imperative that governs how Rabbi Sachs assimilates ideas from his academic sources. And it's what I would call grandstanding for Judaism. Rabbi Sachs will always seize the opportunity to demonstrate how the ethics of the Torah shined in comparison with the prevailing views at the time. But there is a second pedagogic goal that is achieved by broad statements such as the one that we have here on the screen. With apologies to my rabbinic colleagues here, sermons about the virtues of forgiveness, and forgive me for saying this, can be rather dull. We all intuitively grasp what forgiveness is about and why it's important. But when Rabbi Sachs shares with us that forgiveness actually has a history, that there was something else, quote, before forgiveness, his writing suddenly becomes not only uplifting, but fascinating and therefore even more inviting. Now, Constant makes two additional comments about the Joseph story that Rabbi Sacks omits in his writings, and it is here where we see how he makes the accommodations necessary for his lay audience at the expense of some degree of comprehensiveness and nuance found in his academic sources. In the first comment, Constant notes a fact that will astonish many here. The biblical word for forgive, salach or slicha, appears 49 times in the Tanakh. But in all cases, it is within the context of God and man, either when a human agent asks God for forgiveness or when God grants forgiveness to a human agent. There are no instances in the Tanakh where one person asks slicha of another person. And there are no instances in the Tanakh where a person grants slicha to another, using that term, including in the story of Joseph and his brothers. Now, to adequately address this point, Rabbi Sacks would have needed to delve into philology and the inner workings of biblical Hebrew, an exercise not well suited for a piece for a general audience. And so, although he frequently cites Constant's observation about the Joseph story, that the Joseph story contains elements of forgiveness that are not found in Greek and Latin literature, he makes no mention of Constant's note, that the surprising note of the context of the word slicha in any of his writings. But we can, however, see an oblique reference to this issue. Joseph forgave. That was a first in history. Yet the Torah hints that the brothers did not fully appreciate the significance of his words. After all, he did not explicitly use the word forgive. He told them not to be distressed. He said, "It is not you, but God." He told them their act had resulted in a positive outcome. That is why the Torah recounts a second event years later after Jacob had died. The brothers sought a meeting with Joseph, fearing that he would now take revenge. They concocted a story. They sent words to Joseph saying, "Your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers for the sins and the wrongs they committed." The Hebrew, "Sa na'afesha achecha v'chatatam," in treating you so badly. Now please forgive the sins of the servants of the God of your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. What they said was a white lie, but Joseph understood why they said it. The brothers used the word forgive, this is the first time it appears explicitly in the Torah, because they were still unsure about what Joseph meant. And so even though, according to Rabbi Sacks, the Torah does not use the term lisloach to describe their request, Rabbi Sacks finds a synonym for it, and more on that in a moment. Constant raises a second point about the Joseph story that Rabbi Sacks likewise chooses to omit. To illustrate the point, imagine that you are dismissed from your place of work on unjust grounds. If you remain out of work for a long time, you are likely to harbor great resentment over your mistreatment. But imagine a situation where you quickly find new employment and that your new position is more remunerative and rewarding in every imaginable way. Your firing, it turns out, was a blessing in disguise. Here, you are far less likely to harbor resentment, since it was the very injustice of you being fired that opened the door of opportunity. Constant notes that Joseph's forgiveness of the brothers occurs under highly specific and unusual circumstances. The brothers had surely perpetrated an injustice on Joseph, but in the end, their injustice was instrumental to his rise and success. So under such circumstances, how are we to assess the forgiving attitude of the former victim, Joseph? Can forgiveness under such circumstances serve as an inspirational model for normal cases where the offense only leads to the detriment of the victim? Although Constant raised this issue, Rabbi Sacks makes no mention of it. To do so, metaphorically speaking, would be to let the air out of the balloon of Joseph as a model for forgiveness, and thereby subvert Rabbi Sacks' pedagogic aims. In his discussion of interpersonal forgiveness in the Hebrew Bible, Constant mentions only the story of Joseph, and with good reason. There are indeed in the Bible several accounts of interpersonal rupture and repair, such as Yaakov and Esav, Judah and Tamar, Hannah and Eli the high priest. But the Joseph story is the only one where there is speech between the characters that seems to even approximate a process of what we would call asking for and receiving forgiveness. This leads Rabbi Sacks to speculate on this surprising observation. He says, why then is there so little reference to interpersonal forgiveness in the Bible? And the reason is that the Bible is a book, a library of books, about the relationship between God and human beings. It is about heaven and earth, divine command and human response. It is not primarily about interpersonal relationships at all. Once the Torah has established the principle of human forgiveness in the Joseph story, as it does here in the Joseph narrative, it does not need to repeat it. Now, Rabbi Sachs is correct to note that interpersonal forgiveness is not a topic oft found in the Hebrew Bible. For Rabbi Sachs, this is because the Bible focuses on the relationship between God and man, not man and his fellow man. But I, reverently and respectfully, would argue otherwise. Interpersonal forgiveness, as we know it, is absent from the Bible because it is absent from the ancient world, Israel included. We saw earlier that the word slicha is employed exclusively with regard to forgiveness between God and man. Rabbi Sachs translated the brother's call for here, sa na lefesha avadecha, as forgive your servant's sin. But examination of the phrase sa fesha across the Tanakh suggests an implication other than forgive me. In all cases where individuals call sa na pesha, literally call for the sin to be lifted, it is always within the context of a commutation of a sentence, usually a death sentence. When the brothers exclaim, lift up the sin of your servant, sa na pesha, it is a call for clemency, a call to be spared. Indeed, Scripture records that the proximate cause of their entry to Yosef was fear of reprisal on his part in the wake of Jacob's passing. This is quite different than the expression of regret and remorse for having done wrong that we normally equate with asking for forgiveness in the sense of moral transformation. To put things more starkly, we simply have no word in biblical Hebrew for interpersonal forgiveness. Even the term mechila is exclusive to rabbinic literature and nowhere found in the Bible. I would add likewise that the Bible knows no word for apology or to apologize. In fact, I would claim that the account of Joseph and his brothers in Genesis 50 seems to display the dynamics of restoring status and honor to the offended party quite well. This is evident in the play of language between Joseph's own dreams at the outset of the story and the language employed in Genesis 50 as the brothers reconcile with Joseph. Here we find the Leitvort, Vehine, behold, in every phrase of the dream. Vehine anachnu ma'almim alumim b'toch hasadeh. Vehine kama lumati v'gam nitzava. Vehine tisuben alumotechem v'tishtachavben alumati. Hine chalamti chalam od. Vehine hashemesh v'areach v'chadasar kochavim mishtachavim li. This all emerges as highly significant when we arrive at the scene of reconciliation between Joseph and his brothers in Genesis 50. Here, the brothers are not focused on remorse, but on begging for their lives. They realize that the key to their survival is to actualize what Joseph had envisioned in those dreams. Vayilchu gam echa vayiplu lefanav vayomru hinenu lecha le'avadim. Indeed, the brothers had already prostrated themselves before Joseph earlier in the narrative, but that was when he was known to them only as the viceroy of Egypt, and his identity as Joseph was hidden. Now, and for the first time, they bow before him as their brother Joseph in a gesture of self-abasement, just as Joseph had told them they would in his dreams. Thus, on many accounts, we may question whether the story of Joseph and his brothers is a true account of forgiveness as a moral transformation of both offender and victim. To be sure, ancient Israel, like all cultures, at all times had its protocols of how relationships heal from a state of rupture to a state of repair. But when we speak of forgiveness between Joseph and his brothers, or between any two parties in the Tanakh, these processes must be contextualized within the social worlds with which those individuals interact. Everywhere, at all times, individuals are embedded in a larger social world with differing notions of kinship, social mobility, class structure, and religious practice. The processes of forgiveness, therefore, may be different across cultures. We cannot open the Bible and expect it to mirror our own world. The culturally conditioned nature of reconciliation and forgiveness is a hot topic in the academy. In fact, in just 2 weeks' time, a conference with the title The First International Conference on Forgiving and Being Forgiven within an intracultural perspective will be held right here at Ilan University under the aegis of the Department of Criminology. Investigating how a broad range of cultures navigates the road from rupture to repair can provide us with a control and a vocabulary to better understand these dynamics within biblical literature. I conclude with one small example to demonstrate the potential. In Genesis 38, Judah wrongly accuses Tamar of having committed adultery, when in fact it was he who had impregnated her when she posed as a prostitute to ensnare him. At the close of the story, Judah receives damning evidence from Tamar that he had impregnated her. Judah claims, he exclaims, she is more righteous than I. But notice the dynamics here are far removed from how we think of forgiveness and how it works. We might well say that Judah should have apologized to her personally, not an exclamation, she is more righteous than I, tzadka mimeni, but a direct address to her. You are more right than I. The text is silent about Tamar's reaction. We might have expected Tamar to be magnanimous and declare her willingness to forgive him, having seen his contrition. But I would claim that the dynamics between Yehuda and Tamar are best understood when this story of reconciliation is read through the lens of an honor culture. As laid out by Julian Pitt Rivers and his followers, in such a culture, the value of a person in his or her own eyes is largely a function of their value in the eyes of their social group. Here, the court of public reputation looms large. When Judah's messengers inform him that he has been unable to find the harlot that he slept with and has been unable to retrieve the personal items he left with her, Judah panics. Let her keep what she has, or we will become a laughingstock, he cries, fearing that she will let him out, thus diminishing his status in the court of public reputation. Given this, we can well understand the story's conclusion. In this honor culture, Tamar is not primarily interested in a personal apology from Judah, nor in an expression of remorse. She wishes for her honor to be upheld in the court of public reputation. Judah's public declaration, she is more right than I, is exactly what is called here and satisfies her fully. I end as I began, with a personal note. Early in my academic career, I read Rabbi Sachs' work on the Torah as a political manifest, radical then and radical now. From an academic perspective, I saw so much potential in what he wrote that his work sparked for me what became a monograph on the subject. The same is here true now. I would never have known that there was a field called Forgiveness Studies without reading Rabbi Sachs' invocation of Constance's book and his explication of the Joseph story. And now, for the second time in my career, comments by Mori Rabbi, Rabbi Sachs, are serving for me as the trigger for a book-length project. My comments today are the initial musings in a forthcoming book to be titled, Without Apology, Without Forgiveness, The Restoration of Relationships in the Hebrew Bible. Thank you very much.